The photograph showed up in my email on a Thursday morning in late April, sent by someone named Rita Castellano, who identified herself as a genealogist working on family trees for clients in the Fayetteville, North Carolina area. The image was a wedding photo from 1979, showing a man in a brown suit standing next to a woman in a simple white dress, both of them smiling in front of what looked like a courthouse or municipal building. And the man in the photograph was unmistakably my Uncle Thomas Garrett, my mother's younger brother who had died in 2016 after what we'd all believed was a quiet bachelor life spent working construction jobs across the Southeast. Rita's email explained that she'd found the photo in the estate papers of a woman named Margaret Castellano, who had died in Fayetteville 3 months earlier. That Margaret's daughter had hired Rita to trace family connections for inheritance purposes, and that the marriage certificate attached to the photograph listed the groom as Thomas William Crawford, not Thomas William Garrett, married to Margaret Ann Hoffman on June 14, 1979, at the Cumberland County Courthouse. I stared at that photograph for 20 minutes trying to understand how my uncle could have gotten married under a different name, why none of us had ever heard about a wife, and what other pieces of his life had been constructed under identities we'd never known existed. The marriage certificate was official and properly filed, showing Thomas William Crawford and Margaret Ann Hoffman united in marriage by a Cumberland County magistrate, witnessed by 2 people whose names meant nothing to me, recorded in the county register with all the legal authority of any other marriage performed in North Carolina in 1979. Rita had attached copies of other documents she'd found among Margaret's papers, utility bills and lease agreements and tax returns, all listing Thomas Crawford as Margaret's husband, showing an address on Bragg Boulevard in Fayetteville, where they'd apparently lived together from 1979 until 1984, when the paper trail ended, and Thomas Crawford seemed to disappear from the public record. My uncle had visited our family in Virginia regularly during those same years, showing up for holidays and family gatherings, always alone, always explaining that construction work kept him moving from job to job and that he hadn't found anyone willing to put up with his transient lifestyle long enough to settle down and get married. We'd accepted those explanations without question, had treated him as the family wanderer who showed up when he could and disappeared for months at a time into projects we assumed were exactly what he claimed they were, never imagining that he was maintaining a completely separate identity in a city 3 hours south of where we lived. Fayetteville spreads across the sandy plains of eastern North Carolina around Fort Bragg, a military town that has always attracted transient populations of soldiers and defense contractors, and people looking to disappear into the anonymity that comes from living in a place where everyone is from somewhere else. The streets near the base are lined with pawn shops and cheap motels and businesses that cater to young soldiers spending their paychecks on the kinds of temporary pleasures that don't require long-term commitment or deep roots in the community. By the time I drove down to investigate what my uncle had been doing there in the late 1970s and early 1980s, much of the city had been transformed by waves of development that had pushed the military-focused businesses farther from downtown and replaced them with chain restaurants and shopping centers that looked like every other American suburb. But the bones of the older city remained visible in neighborhoods like the one on Bragg Boulevard, where my uncle and Margaret had lived, areas where small houses from the post-war years still stood alongside newer construction, where the architecture documented decades of people arriving and leaving as the military rotated personnel through the base and the economy rose and fell with defense spending. If you want to discover how my uncle lived under 2 different names for 5 years and maintained a marriage none of us knew existed, subscribe now, because the evidence I found in Fayetteville will reveal secrets that challenge everything we think we know about the people in our own families. I started at the Cumberland County Register of Deeds, requesting copies of all documents filed under the name Thomas William Crawford between 1975 and 1990, and the clerk brought out a folder containing marriage certificates, property records, and court documents that created a paper trail for someone who had apparently existed in parallel to my uncle's official life. The property records showed that Thomas Crawford had purchased a small house on Bragg Boulevard in August 1979, 2 months after the wedding, paid for with a VA loan that indicated military service I'd never heard my uncle mention in any of the stories he'd told about his background. The deed listed his occupation as construction supervisor and showed Margaret Crawford as his wife with community property rights to the house, and the mortgage had been paid regularly, until June 1984, when the property was sold to a real estate investment company for a price that suggested financial distress rather than a planned relocation. I found divorce papers filed in September 1984, Margaret Crawford petitioning for dissolution of marriage on grounds of abandonment, stating that Thomas Crawford had left the marital home in May 1984 and had not been heard from since, despite her attempts to locate him through his last known employer and through relatives whose names she didn't know. The clerk watched me photograph those documents and asked if I was related to Thomas Crawford, and when I explained that he was my uncle but that we'd known him under a different name, her expression shifted into something that suggested she'd seen similar situations before in a military town where people reinvented themselves regularly. She said the name Crawford wasn't uncommon around Fayetteville, that Fort Bragg had attracted thousands of soldiers over the decades, and that many of them had stayed in the area after their service ended, that it was possible my uncle had used his middle name or his mother's maiden name or simply adopted a new identity for reasons that made sense to him at the time. I asked if there were any other records that might explain why my uncle had been living under an assumed name, and she suggested checking military personnel records at Fort Bragg if he'd served there, or looking through newspaper archives for any mentions of Thomas Crawford that might provide context for his life in Fayetteville during those years. The divorce decree showed that Margaret had been granted the dissolution by default after Thomas failed to respond to the petition, that she'd been awarded the house and all community property, and that she'd been relieved of any obligation to support or contact her former husband, who had disappeared without providing any explanation or forwarding address. I drove to the address on Bragg Boulevard, a neighborhood of small brick ranches built in the 1950s and 1960s, most of them showing the wear of decades without major renovation, their yards filled with cars in various states of repair, and children's toys scattered across porches and driveways. The house my uncle had owned was now painted a different color and had an addition on the back that hadn't existed in the photos from Margaret's estate, but the basic structure was recognizable from the pictures Rita had sent me, images of my uncle and Margaret standing in front of the house at Christmas or working in the small garden that had occupied the side yard. An older woman was working in the yard next door, trimming bushes with the methodical focus of someone who'd performed the same task countless times, and when I approached and asked if she'd lived on the street long enough to remember the people who'd owned the Crawford house in the early 1980s, she straightened up and studied me with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to be cautious about strangers asking questions. Her name was Dorothy Palmer, and she'd lived in her house since 1972, had watched the neighborhood change as military families rotated through, and the original owners aged and sold to investors who turned the properties into rentals. She remembered Thomas Crawford as a quiet man who kept to himself, worked long hours, and seemed devoted to his wife Margaret in the casual ways that young couples demonstrate affection without making a show of it. Dorothy said Thomas had been handy with repairs and had helped her fix her fence one summer, that he'd mentioned growing up in the mountains of western North Carolina and learning construction work from his father, details that matched what I knew about my uncle's actual childhood in the Asheville area where my mother's family had lived for generations. She remembered that Thomas and Margaret had seemed happy for the first few years of their marriage, had hosted occasional barbecues, and had been friendly with neighbors in the unobtrusive way that people are when they're building a life together without attracting attention or creating drama. But something had changed in 1983 or 1984 when Thomas had started coming home less frequently, and Margaret had started looking worried and distracted in ways that suggested trouble in the marriage. Dorothy said she'd watched the marriage deteriorate over those final months, had seen Thomas loading belongings into his truck in the middle of the night, had noticed that his visits home became shorter and less frequent until they stopped entirely in the spring of 1984. Margaret had knocked on Dorothy's door one evening in May, asking if she'd seen Thomas or knew where he might have gone, and Dorothy had said she hadn't seen him in weeks, that his truck hadn't been parked at the house, and that she'd assumed he was away on a construction job somewhere. Margaret had explained that Thomas had called from somewhere in Virginia, saying he needed to take care of family business and would be back in a few days, but that had been 3 weeks earlier, and she hadn't heard from him since, couldn't reach him at the number he'd called from, and was starting to worry that something had happened to him. Dorothy had suggested calling the police or contacting his employer, but Margaret had said she didn't know who his current employer was, that Thomas had been working as an independent contractor for the past year, and had been vague about which jobs he was taking and where they were located. I asked Dorothy if she remembered anything else unusual about Thomas Crawford, any details that might explain why he'd been living under a name different from his birth name, and she thought for a moment before saying that Thomas had once mentioned something about needing a fresh start, about leaving behind problems that had followed him from his earlier life, though he'd never elaborated on what those problems were. She said he'd been careful about mail, had always collected it himself before Margaret could see what arrived, and had kept a post office box in addition to their home address, behaviors that had seemed odd at the time, but that Dorothy had attributed to the general privacy that some people preferred around their financial affairs. After Thomas disappeared, Dorothy had helped Margaret sort through the belongings he'd left behind, and she remembered finding very few personal documents, no birth certificate or school records or photographs from before his marriage. Nothing that would have provided Margaret with information about his family or his life before he appeared in Fayetteville in the late 1970s. It was as if Thomas Crawford had materialized fully formed in 1979 with no history and no connections to any life that existed before that year, and when he left in 1984, he'd vanished just as completely, leaving behind only the legal documents that recorded his brief passage through Margaret's life. The construction company Thomas had worked for no longer existed, having gone bankrupt in the late 1980s when the local economy contracted and building projects dried up, but I found the former owner living in a retirement community on the south side of Fayetteville. His name was Earl Dawson, a man in his 80s who'd spent 40 years in the construction business and who remembered Thomas Crawford as one of the best workers he'd ever employed, someone who showed up on time, worked hard, and had the kind of carpentry skills that came from years of apprenticeship and practice. Earl said Thomas had appeared in his office one day in 1978 looking for work, had provided references from contractors in Tennessee and Georgia that Earl had called and verified, and had started on a framing crew the following Monday. The references had checked out, Earl said, though looking back he realized he'd never actually spoken to anyone who'd worked directly with Thomas. Just people who confirmed that someone by that name had worked for their companies during the periods Thomas had claimed, and it was possible those references had been arranged somehow, or that Thomas had worked briefly for those companies just long enough to establish a paper trail he could use for future employment. Earl remembered that Thomas had been skilled at finishing work, the kind of detailed carpentry that required patience and precision, and that he'd moved quickly from general labor to supervisor positions where he managed other workers and dealt with clients directly. Thomas had been good with people, Earl said, had a way of explaining construction processes that made clients feel informed and confident rather than confused and anxious, and Earl had been grooming him for a partnership in the company when Thomas had abruptly quit in early 1984 with a vague explanation about family obligations that required him to leave the area. Earl had been disappointed but not surprised, he said, because construction workers were often transient by nature, following jobs and opportunities wherever they led, and rarely staying in one place long enough to put down real roots. He'd written Thomas a final paycheck and a letter of recommendation, and he'd expected to hear from him eventually asking for a reference for another job, but Thomas had never contacted him again, and Earl had eventually filed the whole situation away, as another example of talented people passing through his life without explanation. I asked Earl if he remembered anything unusual about Thomas's behavior or background, anything that might explain why he'd been using a different name, and Earl said that Thomas had always been slightly evasive about his past, had deflected personal questions with jokes or changes of subject, and had maintained a distance from the other workers that suggested he didn't want anyone getting too close or asking too many questions. Earl had attributed that reserve to the natural privacy that some people preferred, but he'd also noticed that Thomas never invited co-workers to his house, never attended company parties or social events, and had always paid his taxes and handled his finances through a lawyer rather than dealing directly with Earl's bookkeeper the way most employees did. Those behaviors had seemed odd but not alarming at the time, Earl said, but in retrospect they suggested someone who was carefully managing the boundaries between his work life and his personal life in ways that went beyond normal privacy concerns. The name Thomas Crawford led me to military records at Fort Bragg, where a helpful clerk in the personnel office searched through archived files and found a service record for a Thomas William Crawford, who had been stationed at the base from 1975 to 1978, serving in the 82nd Airborne Division as a construction engineer. The record showed an honorable discharge in July 1978, a decent service history with no disciplinary problems, and a home of record listed as Knoxville, Tennessee, an address that meant nothing to me, and that didn't match anything I knew about my uncle's background. I requested copies of the full personnel file, and when the documents arrived 2 weeks later, they included enlistment papers showing Thomas William Crawford had been born in Knoxville in 1951, had enlisted at age 24, and had listed next of kin as a brother named James Crawford, at an address that no longer existed according to current property records. The physical description matched my uncle, 6 feet tall, brown hair, hazel eyes, and the photograph on the military ID was unmistakably him at age 24, young and serious in his uniform, but recognizable as the same person who'd visited our family gatherings in the 1980s and 1990s. The problem was that my uncle Thomas Garrett had been born in Asheville in 1951, not in Knoxville, and his military service, according to family records, had been with the Marine Corps from 1969 to 1972 during the Vietnam era, not with the Army at Fort Bragg in the mid-1970s. I pulled my uncle's obituary from 2016 and compared the biographical details to what I was finding in the Thomas Crawford records, and nothing aligned except the birth year and the general physical description. The obituary listed my uncle as a lifelong resident of North Carolina who'd worked in construction and had never married, survived by his sister, my mother, and various nieces and nephews, buried in the family plot in Asheville, where 3 generations of Garretts had been laid to rest. I called my mother and asked her about my uncle's military service, whether she remembered details about when and where he'd served, and she said he'd enlisted in the Marines right out of high school in 1969, had done a tour in Vietnam, and had come home in 1972 different from the boy who'd left, quieter and more distant in ways that the family had attributed to whatever he'd experienced during the war that he never talked about. My mother said Thomas had drifted after his discharge, had worked construction jobs around North Carolina and Virginia, had never settled in one place long enough to build a career or a family, and had remained close to the family but always slightly apart, always holding something back that none of them could quite reach or understand. She remembered him disappearing for months at a time in the late 1970s and early 1980s, explaining those absences as work-related travel that took him to jobs in other states. And she'd accepted those explanations because Thomas had always been restless, and the construction industry required workers to go where the projects were. I asked if she'd ever heard him mention the name Crawford or anyone named Margaret, and she said no, that Thomas had kept his personal life private and had never introduced them to anyone he was dating or seeing seriously, and they'd all assumed he preferred being alone to the complications of relationships and commitment. When I told her about the marriage certificate and the house in Fayetteville and the military records showing service under a different name, there was a long silence on the phone before she said that none of it made sense with the brother she'd known, but that Thomas had always been good at keeping secrets, and that she'd learned years ago not to push him for information he didn't want to share. I hired a private investigator in Knoxville to trace the Crawford family records, to see if there had been a real Thomas William Crawford whose identity my uncle had somehow assumed or borrowed, and 3 weeks later the investigator called with information that complicated everything I thought I understood. There had been a Thomas William Crawford born in Knoxville in 1951, the investigator said, and he died in a car accident in 1974 at age 23, buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of the city with a military headstone marking his service in Vietnam with the Marine Corps. The real Thomas Crawford had enlisted in 1969, the same year as my uncle, had served in the same units and the same areas of Vietnam, and had been discharged in 1972 with an honorable service record that matched the general timeline of my uncle's military career. The investigator suggested that my uncle and the real Thomas Crawford had known each other during their service, that they'd been similar enough in age and appearance that my uncle had been able to assume Crawford's identity after his death, and that he'd used that identity to enlist in the Army under a new name and create a completely separate life in Fayetteville. The investigator sent me copies of the real Thomas Crawford's death certificate and burial records, documents that showed he'd died in March 1974, more than a year before the military records showed Thomas Crawford enlisting at Fort Bragg. That gap suggested my uncle had waited after his friend's death, had gathered the necessary documents and identification, and had then presented himself at a recruiting office as Thomas Crawford looking to serve his country in a branch of the military where his previous Marine service wouldn't show up in routine background checks. The investigator said that identity theft in the 1970s had been relatively easy compared to modern standards, that before computerized databases and instant verification systems, someone with the right documents could assume a new identity and maintain it for years if they were careful and didn't attract attention from authorities who might look too closely at their background. My uncle had apparently been careful, had built a credible service record as Thomas Crawford, had married and bought a house and worked as a civilian contractor, all while maintaining his original identity as Thomas Garrett, for family purposes, and for whatever life he was living outside of Fayetteville. The question that kept returning was why my uncle had needed a second identity in the first place, what he'd been running from or hiding that required him to become someone else for 5 years in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I searched through newspaper archives from that period, looking for any mention of Thomas Garrett in connection with crimes or legal troubles, and I found a brief article from a Greensboro paper in 1976 reporting that Thomas William Garrett had been arrested in connection with a construction site theft, that he'd been charged with stealing materials worth several $1,000s from a project where he'd been working as a foreman. The article said he'd been released on bail and was awaiting trial, but I found no follow-up stories about the outcome of the case, no conviction records or court documents that would explain what had happened after the arrest. I called the Greensboro Police Department and requested information about the case, and a helpful detective searched through archived files and found that the charges had been dropped in early 1977 after the real thief had been identified, that my uncle had been cleared of wrongdoing and the arrest record had been expunged, but that the incident had apparently damaged his reputation in the local construction community enough that he'd left the area and started over somewhere else. That timeline aligned with my uncle's appearance in Fayetteville as Thomas Crawford in 1975, suggesting he'd assumed the new identity shortly after the theft charges had been filed and before they'd been resolved, perhaps believing that the criminal record would prevent him from finding work even if he was eventually cleared. The investigator said it was possible my uncle had panicked, had seen the arrest as the end of his career and his reputation, and had decided that starting over with a clean identity was easier than fighting to clear his name and rebuild trust in communities where everyone had read about his arrest in the local paper. The fact that the charges had been dropped and his record expunged hadn't mattered if my uncle had already committed to living as Thomas Crawford, had already enlisted in the army and created a new life that depended on maintaining the false identity he'd assumed. Rita Castellano, the genealogist who'd first contacted me about the wedding photo, had been working with Margaret Crawford's daughter to settle the estate, and she put me in touch with the daughter whose name was Lynn Castellano, a woman in her early 50s who'd grown up knowing Thomas Crawford as her stepfather for the brief period he'd been married to her mother. Lynn agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Fayetteville, and when we sat down she told me that she'd been 7 years old when her mother married Thomas, that she remembered him as kind but distant, someone who'd tried to be a good father figure, but who'd always seemed preoccupied with concerns he never shared with the family. Lynn said her mother had loved Thomas deeply, had believed they were building a future together, and had been devastated when he disappeared in 1984 without explanation or warning, leaving behind only a brief phone message saying he had to take care of family business and would be in touch soon. That message had been the last time Margaret had heard his voice, Lynn said, and her mother had spent months trying to locate him, calling his former employers and checking with people who might have known where he'd gone, before finally accepting that he wasn't coming back and filing for divorce so she could move forward with her life. Lynn showed me photographs of her childhood with Thomas, images that documented birthday parties and holiday celebrations, pictures of Thomas teaching her to ride a bicycle and helping with school projects, moments that looked like ordinary family life, except for the knowledge that the man in those pictures had been living under a false name and maintaining connections to another family in Virginia that Margaret and Lynn knew nothing about. Lynn said her mother had remarried in 1987 to a man who'd adopted her and given her his last name, but that she'd always remembered Thomas Crawford as the first person who'd tried to be a father to her after her biological father had left when she was a baby. She said her mother had kept all the photographs and documents from the marriage, had stored them in a box that Lynn had found after Margaret's death, and that discovering those materials had prompted her to hire Rita to investigate whether Thomas had any living relatives who might want to know about Margaret's passing and might be entitled to any information about the brief marriage that had meant so much to her mother, but that had ended so abruptly and mysteriously. I asked Lynn if her mother had ever tried to find Thomas after the divorce was finalized, whether she'd made any attempts to learn what had happened to him or why he'd disappeared. And Lynn said that Margaret had occasionally searched for him online after the internet became widely available, typing his name into search engines and looking through social media profiles, but that she'd never found any trace of Thomas Crawford after 1984. Lynn said her mother had assumed he'd died, or had moved far away and changed his name again, that he'd been running from something that made it impossible for him to stay in one place or maintain relationships with people who might ask too many questions about his past. Margaret had told Lynn that she'd loved Thomas despite not fully understanding him, that she'd accepted his reserve and his privacy as parts of who he was, and that she'd hoped until the end of her life that he'd eventually contact her and explain why he'd left, what had driven him away from the marriage and the life they'd been building together. Lynn said her mother's death from cancer in January had been difficult, that watching her decline over the final months had brought up unresolved feelings about Thomas, and the abandonment Margaret had never fully processed or recovered from. Margaret had mentioned Thomas frequently during those last weeks, Lynn said, had wondered aloud whether he was still alive, and whether he ever thought about the family he'd left behind in Fayetteville, had expressed regret that she'd never been able to tell him that she'd forgiven him for leaving, and that she'd understood that sometimes people make choices that hurt the people they love without meaning to cause that pain. Lynn had promised her mother that she'd try to find information about Thomas after Margaret was gone, that she'd make an effort to track down any relatives or connections that might provide closure, or at least some understanding of what had happened to the man Margaret had married and lost. That promise had led to hiring Rita, and Rita's research had led to me. And now Lynn was sitting across from me, learning that the man she'd known as her stepfather had been living under an assumed identity and had maintained a completely separate existence that Margaret had never suspected. I showed Lynn the photographs of my uncle from family gatherings in the 1980s and 1990s, images of Thomas Garrett at Christmas dinners and summer barbecues, always smiling but always slightly apart from the group, and Lynn confirmed that the man in those pictures was the same person she'd known as Thomas Crawford. We sat there comparing photographs, creating a timeline that showed my uncle moving between two identities and two families, spending holidays with us in Virginia as Thomas Garrett, while maintaining his marriage to Margaret in Fayetteville as Thomas Crawford, somehow managing the logistics of that double life without either side discovering the deception. Lynn said the photographs of my uncle with our family during the years he was married to her mother were painful to see, evidence that he'd been present and engaged with one family while withdrawing from another, that he'd been capable of showing up and participating in normal family life, even as he was preparing to abandon the marriage and the role he'd assumed in Margaret and Lynn's household. The final piece of the puzzle came from my uncle's personal effects. Boxes of belongings my mother had stored in her attic after his death in 2016. Materials I'd looked through briefly after the funeral but hadn't examined carefully because they'd seemed to contain only the ordinary accumulation of a lifetime spent working and moving between jobs. Among those boxes I found a folder containing documents related to the 1976 theft charges, newspaper clippings about the arrest, and a letter from my uncle's lawyer explaining that the charges had been dropped and his record cleared. There was also a journal my uncle had kept during the late 1970s, entries that documented his decision to assume Thomas Crawford's identity and his reasons for believing that starting over with a clean name was the only way to escape the stigma of the arrest and rebuild his career in construction. My uncle had written that the theft charges had destroyed his reputation even though he'd been innocent, that contractors who'd previously hired him regularly had stopped returning his calls after the arrest, and that he'd realized the only way to continue working in his chosen field was to become someone else, someone without a criminal record or a history that potential employers could use to judge him before giving him a chance. The journal entries showed that my uncle had struggled with the decision to assume a false identity, that he'd recognized the moral and legal problems with using a dead man's name and documents, but that he'd convinced himself that Thomas Crawford would have understood and approved since they'd been friends during their Marine service and had survived experiences in Vietnam that created bonds deeper than civilian life could easily accommodate or understand. My uncle had written that he'd intended the false identity to be temporary, that he'd planned to use it only until he'd established a new reputation and could return to using his real name without the theft charges following him, but that the longer he lived as Thomas Crawford, the harder it became to imagine going back to being Thomas Garrett. He'd written about meeting Margaret and falling in love with her, about building a marriage based on the false foundation of a borrowed identity, and about the growing anxiety that she would discover the truth and leave him, or that authorities would catch up with his deception and arrest him for fraud and identity theft. The journal entries stopped in 1983, but there was a final letter dated May 1984, apparently written but never sent, addressed to Margaret, and explaining that he had to leave because his old life was catching up with him, and he couldn't risk bringing trouble to her and Lynn. My uncle had written that he loved Margaret, but that their marriage had been built on lies he couldn't sustain anymore, that he was returning to his real identity and his real family, and that he hoped she would eventually forgive him for the pain his deception had caused. He'd written that he was Thomas Garrett, not Thomas Crawford, that everything he'd told her about his past had been partially true, but filtered through the false identity he'd assumed after his arrest, and that he couldn't live with the constant fear that she would discover the truth, or that someone from his past would recognize him and expose the fraud he'd been perpetrating for 5 years. The letter ended with an apology and a request that Margaret not try to find him, that she move forward with her life and forget about Thomas Crawford, who had never really existed except as a role he'd played for half a decade. I showed the letter to Lynn when we met again 3 weeks later, and she read it with tears in her eyes, finally understanding why her stepfather had disappeared and why her mother had never been able to find any trace of him after 1984. Lynn said the letter answered questions her mother had carried for 35 years, that it would have brought Margaret some peace to know that Thomas had loved her and had left to protect her rather than because he'd stopped caring or had found someone else. She asked if she could keep the letter, and I said yes, that it belonged to her more than it belonged to me, that it was part of her mother's story and her own childhood, even if the truth it revealed was complicated and painful. Lynn said she'd spent her life wondering what had been wrong with her and her mother that Thomas had left them, whether they'd done something to drive him away, or whether he'd simply decided they weren't worth staying for, and knowing that his departure had been about his own fears and his own past rather than about any failure on their part, changed the way she understood that abandonment and the impact it had had on her relationship with her mother and with men in general. I shared what I'd learned with my mother, showed her the documents and the photographs and the journal entries that revealed her brother's double life. And she said she'd always known Thomas was keeping secrets but had never imagined the extent of the deception he'd maintained. She said the theft charges explained some of his behavior in the late 1970s, the way he'd become more withdrawn and defensive, the way he'd started avoiding family gatherings and had seemed anxious whenever police or authority figures were mentioned in conversation. My mother said she'd asked him once if he was in trouble, if there was anything the family could do to help, and he'd told her everything was fine, that he was just working through some career difficulties and would come out the other side stronger and more focused. She'd believed him because she'd wanted to believe him, because acknowledging that her brother was living a lie would have required her to confront uncomfortable questions about what else he might be hiding, and whether the person they knew as Thomas Garrett was real or just another carefully constructed identity. My mother asked if I thought Thomas had loved Margaret, whether the marriage in Fayetteville had been real or just another part of the elaborate deception he'd constructed, and I said I believed it had been real, that the journal entries and the unsent letters suggested genuine feeling and genuine conflict about the situation he'd created. I said I thought my uncle had loved 2 versions of his life simultaneously, the Thomas Crawford identity that allowed him to work without the stigma of his arrest following him, and the Thomas Garrett identity that connected him to family and history and the person he'd been before everything got complicated. The problem was that maintaining both identities had required constant vigilance and compartmentalization, and eventually the strain of living between those 2 worlds had become unsustainable, and he'd chosen to collapse back into his original identity and abandon the life he'd built as Thomas Crawford. My mother said she wished Thomas had trusted the family enough to tell them the truth, that they would have supported him and helped him work through the consequences of the theft charges, rather than watching him disappear into a false identity that ended up causing more pain than the original problem ever would have. The house on Bragg Boulevard was sold again in 2018 torn down and replaced with a larger structure that bears no resemblance to the modest brick ranch where my uncle lived with Margaret and Lynn in the early 1980s. And the last physical evidence of Thomas Crawford's existence has been erased from the landscape, except for the documents filed in the Cumberland County Courthouse and the photographs Lynn keeps in a box in her home in Raleigh. I've visited Fayetteville 3 times since I first learned about my uncle's double life, walked the streets he walked when he was living as Thomas Crawford, tried to imagine what he was thinking when he was moving between his 2 identities and his 2 families without either side discovering the deception. The military base still dominates the city, its presence shaping the economy and the culture in ways that make Fayetteville feel temporary even for people who've lived there for decades. And I can understand how my uncle might have felt that a place defined by transience and reinvention was the perfect location for someone trying to escape his past and build a new future on the foundation of a borrowed name. Lynn and I have stayed in touch, meeting every few months to share what we've learned about my uncle and to compare our memories of the man we both knew under different names and in different contexts. She's shown me videos her mother recorded in the early 2000s talking about her life. And in one of those recordings, Margaret mentions Thomas Crawford, with a wistfulness that suggests she never fully moved past the abandonment, never quite accepted that the marriage and the love she'd felt had been based on a fundamental deception that invalidated everything they'd shared. Margaret says in the video that she'd loved Thomas for who he was in the moments they were together, that whatever name he was using or whatever past he was hiding from didn't change the fact that he'd been kind to her and to Lynn, that he'd made them feel safe and valued during the years they were together, and that those feelings and those experiences were real, even if the identity he'd assumed to make them possible had been false. Lynn says that watching her mother's video and reading my uncle's journal entries has helped her make peace with a childhood that had been shaped by abandonment and questions that couldn't be answered, and that knowing the truth about why Thomas left has allowed her to forgive both him and her mother for the silence and the secrets that had defined so much of their family's history. The grave in Asheville, where my uncle is buried, lists his name as Thomas William Garrett, the identity he was born with and the identity he returned to after his years as Thomas Crawford came to an end. And there's no mention of the marriage in Fayetteville, or the family he left behind, or the double life he maintained for 5 years in the late 1970s and early 1980s. My mother visits the grave occasionally, leaves flowers and stands there thinking about the brother she thought she knew, trying to reconcile the man who showed up for family holidays with the man who was capable of assuming a false identity and building a completely separate existence based on a dead friend's name and documents. She's told me that she's forgiven Thomas for the deception, that she understands he was trying to solve a problem that seemed insurmountable at the time, and that he made choices that seemed reasonable given his fear of never working again after the theft charges destroyed his reputation. She says that forgiveness doesn't mean she understands everything he did or agrees with the methods he used to escape his problems, but that it means she's accepted that he was a complicated person who struggled with circumstances that tested his integrity and his judgment, and that he did the best he could even if that best involved deception and abandonment that hurt people who loved him. I think about my uncle often now, about the way people construct identities and maintain separate versions of themselves in different contexts, and about how the line between necessary privacy and harmful deception is thinner than we like to believe. My uncle's story isn't unique in its basic structure. People have been reinventing themselves and escaping their pasts for as long as human society has existed. But the specific details of his double life and the way it intersected with real people who loved him and depended on him make it feel personal and immediate in ways that abstract discussions of identity and deception never could. The photograph that started this investigation still sits on my desk, my uncle in his brown suit standing next to Margaret in her white dress, both of them smiling like people who believe they're starting a future together. Neither of them knowing that the marriage is built on foundations that will collapse 5 years later when the weight of the deception becomes too heavy to sustain. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation, where we discover the secret identities that ordinary people assume to escape their pasts and learn how those false names reshape families in ways that echo across generations.